Vermont Territory, 1887, while every settler raced to finish their cabin before winter. Norwegian immigrant Lars Nielsen was still hammering inside his house in late September. His neighbors called it wasteful. They called him foolish. He was building a second cabin inside his living room, an 8 by 12 feet box with double walls packed with sawdust and moss. He positioned the ceiling at 6 feet 10 instead of the standard 10 height everyone else built. He spent for months on what looked like a wooden shipping crate, while others finished their cabins in 6 weeks. Then March 12, 1888 arrived. The great blizzard struck without warning, 3 feet of snow in 18 hours. Temperatures plunged to below zero with winds that shattered windows and drove snow through every crack in standard log walls. Neighbors' big rooms with high ceilings froze despite roaring fires. Families slept in wool coats with frost forming on inside walls. But Lars's second cabin, it stayed so warm he could write in his notebook wearing just shirt sleeves. His thermometers told the story outside for his main room 34. But inside that mocked inner cabin a steady 65. What did he understand about heat, insulation, and survival that everyone else dismissed as foreign nonsense? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and time. We love reading where these documentaries reach. Pre-dawn, March 12, 1888. Outside wind shrieked across the Vermont hills, snow hammering the outer walls of Lars Nielsen's cabin with the steady drum-beat of a blizzard that had been building since midnight. Inside what his neighbors mockingly called his wooden shipping crate, the 45-year-old Norwegian immigrant sat in shirt sleeves, writing in a small notebook by the light of a single tallow candle. 3 thermometers hung at precise locations throughout his homestead, like silent witnesses to an experiment that had taken months to prepare. 1 thermometer dangled outside the main cabin window, its mercury column barely visible through the frost-covered glass. The second hung 6 feet off the floor in the big main cabin room where most frontier families would huddle around their cast-iron stoves on a night like this. The third thermometer hung inside what Lars called his winter room, the 8 by 2 feet inner cabin he had built inside his own living room. Positioned at head height over his narrow bunk, he read each instrument carefully and noted the numbers that would later prove him either a genius or a fool outside. The mercury showed for degrees above zero with wind gusts that rattled the shutters like artillery fire in the main room, where a water bucket had developed a thin skin of ice despite the banked coals in the stove. The temperature held at 34, but inside his mocked inner cabin, the thermometer read a steady 65, a 31-degree difference from the main room and more than 60 warmer than the brutal wind chill that was killing livestock across 3 states. Lars pulled his quilt tighter and heard distant shouting from a neighbor already in trouble somewhere out in the storm. He made one more notation in his ledger, blew out the candle, and settled back into the warmth that had cost him for months of ridicule and this social standing. He had spent 3 years building since arriving from Trondheim. The mockery had started in late August when Lars began marking out an 8 by 12 feet rectangle in one corner of his main room, positioned near his existing cast-iron stove, but not crowding it. While his neighbors raced to complete their cabins before the first frost, Lars was still measuring and calculating, planning a ceiling height of 6 feet 10 so he could stand upright, but keeping the total volume as small as physics would allow. The arithmetic was simple enough for any man who had heated a Norwegian farmhouse through a winter that lasted 7 months. The outer cabin contained roughly 20 by 28 feet with an average height of 10 feet, creating 5,600 cubic feet of air that needed heating. His planned winter room would contain only 672 cub feet, roughly 1/8 the volume. Ephraim Cobb, the ex-soldier who appointed himself spokesman for proper frontier construction, had watched Lars frame the inner walls with tubai for lumber instead of logs, and declared the project both wasteful and unhealthy. "Looks like you're building a rat cage in your parlor, Lars," Cobb had announced to anyone within hearing distance at Mueller's general store. If you want heat, just cut more wood like everybody else. The criticism had grown sharper when Lars chose his materials. Instead of the standard log construction that defined respectability on the frontier, he sheathed his inner walls with rough boards, creating a double wall system with a one-in-air gap that he methodically packed with sawdust and dry moss insulation, materials that any sawmill would provide for free, but that most settlers considered suitable only for temporary repairs. The simple plank door got a quilt tacked inside as a soft gasket, and the floor became a raised wooden platform 6 in above the main cabin's drafty boards. Filled with dry planer shavings and straw, high ceilings are necessary, so smoke has somewhere to go. Cobb had explained to a gathering of neighbors who nodded along with the conventional wisdom that had governed frontier construction since the first Massachusetts settlements. Big volume is good, honest house, while boxed-in spaces are unhealthy. The criticism carried weight because Cobb had built 3 cabins and helped raise a dozen others, establishing himself as the local authority on what worked and what would get a family killed. Lars had offered quiet rebuttals when pressed, though he preferred to let his arithmetic speak for itself. "It's not the smoke I'm worried about," he had told the men gathered around the store's checkerboard one September evening. "It's how fast the woodpile disappears." He had shown them his previous winter's wood ledger, documenting that he had burned 5 full cords to keep the big room barely livable through the cold months, and calculated that he could cut that consumption nearly in half if he only heated 1/8 the volume during the worst weather. The logic had seemed sound to him, drawn from memories of his childhood in rural Norway, where farmhouses featured small heated stew rooms and box beds that stayed warm even when the outer rooms froze solid. He had worked a winter logging crew in Quebec, where a French-Canadian foreman named Hilaire had described his uncle's room within a room arrangement that saved cord after cord of fuel by concentrating heat where men actually slept. He had also talked extensively with Joseph Taco, the Abnaki trapper, who had described how winter wigwams used double layers and low roofs to trap heat in spaces no larger than a generous closet, but practical experience from other climates carried no weight with men who had fought through Vermont winters using methods that had kept their fathers and grandfathers alive. The community had watched Lars spend for solid days framing his inner shell, then another 3 days chinking and packing the insulation, mostly working by lamplight after his regular field work was finished. The project had consumed his evenings through September and into early October, long after sensible men had banked their fires and declared their homes ready for winter. The final insult had come when Lars completed his winter room and began conducting what Ephraim Cobb called full experiments with thermometers and measuring instruments. On calm December nights, when the temperature dropped to 10 or 15, Lars would let his main stove fire burn down to coals, shut himself inside the winter room with only a small pan of embers and a single candle, and record the temperature every hour from dusk to midnight. The results had been consistent enough to fill half a notebook with data that nobody wanted to hear. Now, as the great blizzard of 1888 hammered his outer walls and drove snow through every gap in Conventi, Ono frontier construction, those numbers would either vindicate his months of careful preparation or prove that all his calculating had been nothing more than the delusions of a man too stubborn to build a cabin the way God and common sense intended. The first real test had come in December when a cold front dropped nighttime temperatures to 10 above zero with a steady wind that found every gap in the settlement's hastily chanked walls. Across the hollow, Lars could see the orange glow of his neighbors' windows as they stoked their stoves hard and prepared for a night of sleeping in wool layers while frost formed on the inside of their glass. Ephraim Cobb's chimney poured smoke like a factory stack, and the widow, Martha Briggs, had her hired man splitting wood by lantern light to feed the hungry fire that barely kept her drafty cabin above freezing. Lars decided to run what he called a controlled experiment, though Ephraim would later dismiss it as more evidence of foreign eccentricity. He let his main stove fire burn down to a bed of red coals, gathered his 3 thermometers, and shut himself inside the winter room with nothing more than one small pan of embers balanced on a brick trivet and a single tallow candle. Every hour from dusk to midnight, he recorded the temperatures that would either prove his theory or expose it as the delusion of a man who had spent too much time with pencils and measuring tools. At 6 o'clock in the evening, as the last daylight faded behind the storm clouds, his reading showed the progression that physics demanded, but frontier wisdom rejected. Outside, the mercury read 18 and falling. The big room with its 10 ft ceiling and 5,600 cubic feet of air to heat registered 45 in the center and 38 near the floor where children would normally sleep. Inside the winter room, packed tight with sawdust insulation and scaled to heat, only 672 cubic feet. The temperature held at 52 degrees despite receiving no more heat than a cat might generate. 2 hours later, with his main stove reduced to glowing coals and the outside temperature dropping to 14 degrees, the contrast had sharpened into the kind of data that would have impressed a university professor if any professor had cared about the thermal dynamics of frontier poverty. The big room had fallen to 38 and continued dropping as heat leaked through the log walls and escaped through the high ceiling where warm air naturally rose and cooled the winter room, insulated by double walls and a low ceiling that trapped every degree of warmth, had actually climbed to 62 degrees as his body heat and the small ember pan worked together in the confined space. By midnight, with outside temperatures reaching 12 and a wind that made the mercury seem optimistic, the experiment had delivered results that would reshape how thinking men approached the problem of winter survival. The big room had dropped to 34, cold enough that water would freeze and families would wake with ice crystals on their blankets. The winter room held steady at 60, warm enough that a man could work in shirt sleeves and sleep without fear of frostbite claiming his fingers or toes. The mathematics were simple enough for any homesteader who understood that heating air required fuel, and that fuel cost money, labor, and time that could be spent on other survival tasks. Lars had demonstrated that a space 1/8 the volume could be kept 30 warmer using less than 1/10th the fuel, a ratio that meant the difference between burning 5 cords of wood per winter or burning 2½ cords. In a frontier economy where every cord represented days of cutting, splitting, and hauling, the winter room promised to return a man's investment in better insulation through reduced labor and increased safety, but practical mathematics carried no weight with neighbors who had survived previous winters using methods that their fathers had taught them and their grandfathers had proven in the settlements of Massachusetts and Connecticut. Ephraim Cobb examined Lars's thermometers and declared them faulty, insisting that properly calibrated instruments would show no such dramatic differences. When Lars offered to loan the instruments for Ephraim's own experiments, the ex-soldier dismissed the idea as unnecessary because any fool knows you need room to breathe and space for smoke to rise. The criticism expanded beyond mere technical disagreements into questions of health and morality that reflected deeper anxieties about foreign methods challenging American common sense. It's unhealthy to sleep in such a tight space, Martha Briggs's hired man declared after examining the winter room's dimensions, especially with a coal pan that could poison the air. The concern about carbon monoxide was legitimate enough, though. Lars had positioned his ember pan carefully and cracked his door for ventilation during the experiments. More troubling was the broader suspicion that a man who would voluntarily confine himself in such a small space might lack the frontier virtues of independence and openness that defined proper American character. "I want a house I can walk around in," Ephraim had announced at Miller's store, not a shipping crate that makes a man feel like cargo. The sentiment reflected a cultural investment in spaciousness that went beyond practical concerns about heating costs or fuel efficiency. To the Vermont settlers who had fought for every acre and built their cabins as symbols of their conquest over the wilderness, Lars's winter room represented a troubling retreat into the kind of cramped European-style accommodations that they had crossed an ocean to escape. Yet by January, when a brief thaw allowed neighbors to assess their wood consumption. The winter room's economic advantages had become too obvious to ignore completely. The settlement's wood piles stood like visible scoreboards of efficiency and waste, with most families having burned through 2 cords from their original 6-cord stacks. While Lars had barely touched his carefully measured reserve, his methodical record-keeping showed fuel consumption running at less than half the community average, a savings that translated directly into reduced labor, reduced risk, and increased security against the kind of deep cold that could exhaust a wood pile and leave a family defenseless. Joseph Taco, the Abenaki trapper who moved between the white settlements and the traditional hunting camps, had observed Lars's winter room with the recognition of someone whose people had been solving similar problems for centuries before iron stoves and glass thermometers arrived in the forest. "Your inner cabin is like our winter wigwams," he had told Lars during a January trading visit, only built with boards instead of bark and moss. The comparison was exact enough to be instructive. Both designs use small enclosed spaces, dead air insulation, and thermal mass to create warm refuges within larger protective shells, proving that Lars's innovation was actually the wooden translation of techniques that had kept people alive through countless hard winters. The knowledge that his winter room represented traditional wisdom, rather than dangerous experimentation, had given Lars confidence as the truly severe weather approached, though it did nothing to reduce the skepticism of neighbors who remained convinced that bigger rooms, higher ceilings, and hotter fires represented the only reliable defense against the kind of cold that could kill families in their sleep. The Great Blizzard of 1888 began with deception, as the most dangerous storms often do. Early March had brought several days of unseasonably mild weather and steady rain that convinced many settlers to let their guard down and allow their stove fires to burn low. Confident that the worst of winter had passed them by, some neighbors had even mocked Lars for continuing to sleep in what Ephraim Cobb called the wooden box so late in the season, suggesting that a man who needed such extreme measures to stay warm lacked the hardy constitution that frontier life demanded. The storm struck on March 11th with the sudden violence that would make it one of the most lethal weather events in American history, what meteorologists would later document as a collision between warm Gulf air and Arctic masses created a weather bomb that dropped temperatures from just above freezing to single digits within hours, while winds building to 45 and 50 miles per hour drove snow through every gap in construction that had seemed adequate during milder weather across New England. The storm would ultimately dump 20 to 40 in of snow and create drifts reaching 12 to 40 ft in height, trapping families in their homes and killing livestock by the thousands. In the first hours of the blizzard, as snow began piling against cabin walls and finding its way through gaps and log construction despite moss and mud chinking, the fundamental weaknesses of conventional frontier building revealed themselves with lethal precision. High-ceiling cabins that had seemed spacious and healthy during moderate cold became impossible to heat as thick warm air rose to the rafters while children shivered on floors that remained 20 or 30 colder. Ice crusts formed on inside walls, where moist indoor air met cold log surfaces, and the driving wind created pressure differentials that forced snow through cracks that had been invisible during calmer weather. Lars positioned his 3 thermometers as witnesses to what he suspected would become a contest between competing theories of survival, though he took no pleasure in the approaching vindication of methods that had cost him months of social standing. At 4 o'clock on the morning of March 13th, with the storm reaching its full fury and wind gusts rattling shutters across the settlement, his readings documented the progression that building science would later codify, but that frontier wisdom continued to reject. Outside his cabin, the mercury showed 3 above zero, while wind gusts created effective temperatures well below the capacity of human survival. Without shelter in his main room, where he had banked his fire low to conserve the wood that might need to last for days, the temperature registered 33 at the 6 ft level where his thermometer hung cold. enough that his breath remained visible and frost began forming on metal surfaces. Inside the winter room, insulated by double walls packed with sawdust and heated by the confined space that trapped every degree of warmth, the temperature held at 64 with the kind of stability that allowed a man to sleep without fear and work without gloves by midday on March 13th. As neighbors discovered that their wood piles were disappearing faster than they had calculated, and their cabins were becoming uninhabitable, despite fires that consumed quart after quart of precious fuel. The winter room's advantages had expanded beyond mere comfort into the realm of life and death. Ephraim Cobb's big cabin, measured with a thermometer that Lars had loaned for the experiment, showed the thermal stratification that physics predicted, but Frontier Pride refused to acknowledge. Near his roaring stove, the air temperature reached 54, but at the corner sleeping pallet, where his children huddled near the floor and outside wall, the temperature had dropped to 28, cold enough to kill. Lars documented his own readings with the precision of a man who understood that his data might someday save lives or change how thinking people approached the problem of winter construction. The main room held at 36 despite receiving no direct heat from his carefully managed stove, while the winter room maintained 66 using nothing more than residual warmth from the outer space and the thermal mass created by tight construction and proper insulation. The 31 difference between spaces separated by nothing more than a thin wall demonstrated the power of controlled volume and dead air space to multiply the effectiveness of limited heat sources. The mechanism that created these dramatic temperature differences operated according to principles that any frontier farmer could understand if he set aside prejudice and observed how heat actually behaved in confined spaces. Heat rises naturally, and a high ceiling provides more room for that warmth to escape before it can radiate back down to where people sleep and work. A smaller room contains less air to heat and presents less wall and ceiling area through which that warmth can leak. To the outside, the outer log cabin now functioned as a windbreak and snow shell, like an outer coat that broke the worst of the storm's assault, while the winter room served as the shirt and wool sweater that trapped body heat and multiplied the effectiveness of small heat sources. The human consequences of these thermal dynamics revealed themselves across the settlement as families struggled with indoor temperatures that dropped below the threshold of safe habitation. One neighbor family's infant developed a dangerous cough after spending the night near a cold outside wall, where condensation had frozen and created conditions that no amount of blankets could counteract. Martha Briggs, the elderly widow whose firewood had run low during the storm's second day, faced internal cabin temperatures that approached freezing despite her desperate efforts to maintain a fire with green wood and furniture that burned poorly and produced more smoke than heat in his winter room. Lars maintained conditions that allowed normal life to continue, even as the storm raged outside with violence that would be remembered for generations. The temperature differential that his neighbors had dismissed as instrument error or foreign superstition now represented the difference between a space where children could sleep safely and a space where families fought for survival against cold that penetrated every corner and threatened to overwhelm their defensive measures. The storm's third day brought the kind of sustained assault that tested every assumption about adequate preparation and revealed which construction methods could withstand the combination of driving, snow, bitter cold, and wind that found every weakness in materials and design. Standard cabins became shells that provided little more protection than sophisticated tents, while the winter room demonstrated that proper insulation and controlled volume could create a refuge that remained habitable regardless of conditions outside. By the time dawn broke on March 14th, the settlement faced a reckoning between the methods that had seemed adequate during moderate weather and the techniques that could preserve life. When winter showed its true power, the first appeal for help came at dusk on March 13th when Ephraim Cobb appeared at Lars's door, half-frosted and desperate, his hat rim crusted with ice and his coat stiff with snow that had frozen in the brief journey between cabins. The ex-soldier, who had spent months ridiculing the winter room, now stood in Lars's main cabin, asking if his wife and children could sleep in the very structure he had dismissed as a wooden shipping crate unsuitable for human habitation. Lars paused only long enough to glance at his winter room's dimensions and calculate the human mathematics of survival. The inner cabin measured 8 feet by 12 feet with a built-in bunk occupying 6 and half a foot of one wall, a narrow bench for clothing, and hooks that held the family's winter gear. His own family of 4 already filled the space to its intended capacity, but Ephraim's wife and 3 children would make 7 people total, requiring roughly 18 to 20 square ft per person if they arranged themselves like the Norwegian box beds of his childhood, with children sleeping sideways across the bunk and adults lying along the floor on straw ticks and wool blankets. The arrangement would be tight enough to challenge American sensibilities about personal space and individual comfort. But European peasant families had survived countless hard winters using similar techniques, and the confined space would actually increase the room's heating efficiency. By adding body warmth to the candle and ember pan that provided the only direct heat sources, Lars made the calculation that frontier hospitality demanded and opened his winter room to neighbors who had no other refuge from cold that was dropping toward levels that could kill healthy adults. Within hours of exposure, Martha Briggs arrived, shortly after midnight, helped through the storm by Joseph Taco, who had found her cabin nearly uninhabitable and her firewood exhausted. The Abnaki trappers settled the elderly widow in the winter room and observed the arrangement with the professional interest of someone whose people had been crowding into small winter lodges for generations before European settlers arrived in the forest. The winter room now sheltered 8 people in 96 square ft, creating conditions that would have horrified frontier families during moderate weather. But that represented the difference between life and death when the storm outside was killing livestock in their barns. Lars ran his heating system with the careful precision of an engineer managing a steam boiler, loading his main stove with enough wood to establish a thermal foundation, then allowing it to burn down to coals before switching to the small heat sources that the winter room could accommodate without risking carbon monoxide poisoning or fire. One coal pan positioned on bricks provided steady, radiant warmth, while the tallow candles added both light and the equivalent of a cat's body heat to the total thermal budget. The system produced perhaps 200 watts of heat energy, no more than a modern space heater, but applied to 670 cubic feet of well-insulated space rather than the 5,600 cubic feet that his neighbors were struggling to heat with fires that consumed entire trees. The results appeared on his thermometers with the precision of a laboratory experiment conducted under field conditions that no university scientist would have dared to replicate. Outside temperatures hovered between 3 and 6 above zero with wind gusts that created effective conditions well below the threshold of human survival, while the main cabin room maintained temperatures between 30 and 34, cold enough that water would freeze and breath remain visible. Inside the winter room with 8 people generating body heat in a confined space, the temperature peaked at 70 when everyone was present and settled to 63 degrees by dawn, representing a temperature differential of more than 60 compared to outside conditions, and nearly 30 warmer than the outer room where most frontier families would have attempted to survive the storm. During the peak hours of the blizzard, as wind howled around the cabin with enough force to drive snow through gaps that had been invisible during calmer weather, the winter room provided conditions that allowed normal conversation and comfortable sleep despite the violence outside. Children who would have spent the night shivering in wool coats and multiple blankets could sleep in their regular clothes, while adults found the space warm enough to remove outer garments and move freely without fear of frostbite threatening exposed skin. Ephraim Cobb, lying on the floor near the inner wall that separated the winter room from the main cabin, reached out during the night to touch the boards that Lars had carefully insulated with sawdust and moss. The surface felt barely cool too. His hand, a stark contrast to the outer log walls that had developed a coating of frost and ice despite fires that consumed wood at an unsustainable rate. The tactile evidence of superior insulation performance convinced him, in a way, that thermometer readings and mathematical calculations had failed to do, providing the kind of direct physical proof that frontier men trusted above abstract theories. "How thick did you say you made these walls?" Ephraim asked quietly, careful not to wake the children, who were sleeping peacefully for the first time in 3 days. Lars explained the construction in practical terms that any carpenter could understand. 2 layers of 3/4 in planks with 1 1/2 in of sawdust and moss packed between them, plus ceiling boards with the same insulation system overhead. The total wall thickness measured less than 3 in, but the dead air space trapped within the sawdust created an insulation barrier that outperformed log walls 3 times as thick. "We fought over inches of earth in the war," Ephraim muttered as he settled back onto his improvised bed. "And I never thought I'd see the day an 1.5 inches of sawdust made this much difference." The admission represented more than technical appreciation. It marked the beginning of a social transformation that would reshape how the settlement approached the problem of winter construction and fuel efficiency. Martha Briggs, positioned near the door where she could monitor the main cabin temperature, observed that the winter room remained warmer than her own house had been even during moderate weather with a full fire burning. The comparison highlighted the fundamental inadequacy of standard frontier construction when measured against techniques that had been refined over centuries of northern European winters, and it suggested that American settlers had discarded valuable knowledge in their rush to build quickly and claim territory. As dawn approached and the storm began to show signs of exhaustion, the winter room had demonstrated its capacity to preserve life under conditions that had proven fatal elsewhere in the region. 8 people had survived in comfort using fuel consumption that represented a fraction of what their neighbors had burned, while struggling to maintain barely habitable temperatures in spaces that leaked heat faster than wood fires could replace it. The storm broke on March 15th with the sudden stillness that follows nature's most violent tantrums, leaving behind a landscape transformed by snow drifts that reached the eaves of some cabins and buried others entirely as settlers dug themselves out of what would be remembered as one of the deadliest blizzards in American history. They began tallying losses that extended far beyond property damage into the realm of human life itself. Word traveled slowly through the settlement that an infant had died in a poorly built cabin 3 miles north, where inadequate chinking and thin walls had failed to provide protection against cold that penetrated every corner and overwhelmed the family's defensive measures. In the immediate aftermath, as neighbors compared their experiences and assessed the damage to livestock, buildings, and winter fuel supplies, the performance differences between construction methods became impossible to ignore or dismiss as foreign eccentricity. Martha Briggs, speaking to anyone who would listen at Muller's General Store, described how the winter room had remained warmer during the blizzard than her own house achieved on moderate nights with a full fire burning. Ephraim Cobb, swallowing considerable pride, admitted that his family would have faced serious danger without access to Lars's inner cabin, and that his own big room with its high ceiling had proven nearly impossible to heat despite burning wood at a rate that would have exhausted his winter supply within weeks. The practical conclusions that emerged from these testimonies challenged fundamental assumptions about proper frontier construction that had governed settlement building. Since the earliest Massachusetts colonies, big rooms with high ceilings, long considered the mark of a prosperous and healthy household, revealed themselves as thermal disasters that wasted fuel and endangered lives. When weather turned severe, leaky log shells that had seemed adequate during moderate cold became death traps. When driven snow found every gap in wind pressure forced frigid air through construction joints that had been invisible during calmer conditions. Within months of the blizzard, several neighbors began implementing their own versions of the winter room concept, adapting Lars's basic principles to their existing structures and family needs. Ephraim Cobb built a partial inner partition around his stove area, creating an 8 by 10 feet space with a lowered ceiling that could be heated efficiently during the worst weather while maintaining access to his larger room during moderate temperatures. The widow Briggs hired Joseph Taco to help her frame a winter bedroom inside her existing cabin, using the same double-wall construction with sawdust insulation that had kept Lars's family warm. Throughout the crisis, the adoption process revealed how quickly practical knowledge could spread when demonstrated results overcame cultural resistance to foreign methods. Men who had dismissed Lars's winter room as the product of European backwardness now studied its construction details and requested advice about wall thickness, ceiling height, and insulation materials. The transformation represented more than technical curiosity. It marked a fundamental shift in how the settlement approached the balance between comfort, safety, and fuel efficiency that determined survival margins during severe weather. Joseph Taco observed the community's sudden interest in compact heated spaces with the satisfaction of someone whose traditional knowledge had finally received the respect it deserved. Now they've put a wigwam inside a house and call it innovation, he told Lars during a trading visit, connecting the winter concept to indigenous building practices that had kept people alive through countless hard winters before iron stoves and glass windows arrived in the forest. The comparison highlighted how Lars's supposedly revolutionary idea actually represented the wooden translation of techniques that had been refined over centuries by people who understood that survival depended on working with natural thermal dynamics rather than fighting them through brute force heating. The broader historical context of Lars's innovation became clear as word of the winter concept spread beyond the immediate settlement to neighboring towns and eventually to agricultural publications that documented successful adaptations to extreme weather. Colonial keeping rooms where families had naturally gravitated to the smallest and warmest space during winter months represented the same basic principle applied. With less technical precision, European box beds and Dutch closet beds had used enclosed sleeping spaces to trap body heat and reduce fuel consumption, creating warm refuges within larger structures that might be too expensive to heat completely. Native winter lodges and wigwams had employed compact, often double-layered construction with snow-banked round exterior walls for insulation, using dead airspace and thermal mass to create comfortable interiors despite brutal outside conditions. The winter room combined all these traditional approaches into a design that could be built with frontier materials and tools while delivering performance that exceeded anything achievable through conventional log construction and cast iron heating. Modern building science would later codify the principles that Lars had applied through observation and traditional knowledge, documenting how controlled air volume, effective insulation, and thermal bridging reduction could multiply heating efficiency while improving safety and comfort. House-within-house retrofits and internal insulation strategies would become standard techniques for improving the performance of existing structures when exterior modifications proved impractical or too expensive. The legacy of the winter room extended beyond technical innovation into broader questions about how communities evaluate and adopt new methods, particularly when those methods challenge established practices that carry social and cultural significance. Lars's experience demonstrated that practical results could eventually overcome prejudice and resistance, but only after crisis conditions forced people to acknowledge the inadequacy of conventional approaches that had seemed adequate during moderate challenges. Caleb Nielsen, Lars's eldest son, inherited both the physical cabin and the lessons learned during the blizzard of 1888, carrying the winter room concept into the next generation of frontier construction. When he built his own house several years later, he incorporated a deliberately low-ceiling winter bedroom and tight inner shell from the beginning, avoiding the retrofit compromises that had limited his father's original design. The integration of compact heated spaces into new construction represented the evolution from emergency adaptation to standard practice, proving that the winter room was not a single lucky innovation, but a durable method that could be repeated and improved on a bitter frontier winter. It was not the biggest cabin or the fanciest stove that kept a man alive, but how little space he chose to heat, how tight he built his thermal envelope, and whether he trusted the accumulated wisdom that said survival meant shrinking your world and thickening your walls. When the cold came with the intention to build,